Well, as I said, my name's Vince. I am the executive director for a foundation called With Hope. And the With Hope Foundation was started on May 25th, 2005, when this young lady named Amber Craig, Amber attended church, and she was part of the youth group, and Amber believed a lie. And the Bible talks about that Satan is the father of lies, and whistling microphones, evidently. But Satan is the father of lies, and can I just say this? The same lie that killed Amber is the same lie that kills thousands of teenagers and adults every year. And the lie is simply this. What I'm experiencing, no one else would understand, no one else would relate to, and no one would be able to help me. It is that single lie that kills thousands of people every single year. And it killed Amber. When you walked in, you should have gotten a handout, one of those handouts. You've got one of those trifolds. I want you to go ahead and pull those open. And inside there, you're going to be able to see a couple of those pictures. And the picture on the left was taken of Amber. This is her playing club soccer. She was the starting goalkeeper for varsity or freshman year at her high school. She was an almost 4.0 student. She attended youth group. She went to church. She had a Christian family. She had boyfriends. She had friends on the outside. Should I just grab one of the handhelds? Would that be better?
I think if you just on stage, you're behind the speakers.
If I stand back here, is this better?
Yeah,
A little less feedback? Okay. I'll just duck behind all this stuff then. Okay, this is awesome. Yeah. But I tell you that is because if you look at Amber, you see the picture on the right, the picture that's in the inside of your brochure a little bit more. That picture was taken of Amber 3 days before she killed herself. And I want you to take a look at that picture, and I want you to ask yourself the question, does that look like the face of a teenager who's clinically depressed and suicidal? What do you think? No. And see, many of her friends didn't think so either. Her parents didn't think so. Her youth pastor didn't think so. Because Amber had believed a lie. And it was the lie that I mentioned earlier. And it was out of that that on a late start Wednesday morning, she went into her bedroom before school started and took her own life. I want to introduce you to Amber's mom, Annette. Annette Craig is the one who started the foundation. She's an incredible woman, and I've seen God has used her in incredible ways to literally save, and I believe probably over 1,000 plus lives at this point since the foundation has started. And I want you to hear from her in this interview that she has a little bit more about the foundation as far as how it was started. And I think if you understand that, you'll understand a little bit more about what I'm trying to communicate to you tonight. So take a look at the screens and we'll keep moving.
Well, 6.5 years ago, on May 25th, 2005, on a late start Wednesday morning, after having breakfast with her dad and screwing around in the morning with her brothers, I had left for work early. And my husband left to drive carpool for our youngest son. And within a matter of 5 minutes of him leaving our home, our 14.5-year-old daughter Amber walked into her room and shot and killed herself. That was how suicide entered our world. Prior to that, it wasn't even a blip on our radar screen.
What would you say to kids who are in Amber's situation and contemplating suicide?
What I would tell kids who are thinking about suicide as an option is, first of all, don't do it. You have so much to live for. There's hope. There's help available. You're not alone. And that there is a better way to live. There are other options, and that we can help you find what those options are and achieve your full potential.
What about the families who are grieving the loss of a loved one? Do you have any advice that you would pass along to them?
If you're grieving the loss of a loved one who's taken their life, hang in there. Hang on. It is heartbreaking. It is devastating. It's the worst thing that can happen to a family. But there is hope, and there is help, and you can piece back the nightmare of your life, and you can honor the memory of your loved one, and you can learn from them, and you can help others.
If there was one thing that you could say to Amber that you didn't have the chance to say, what would it be?
Gosh, if there was just one thing I could say to her, we miss her. We wish we would have known. We wish that we knew then what we know now.
Tragic situation more difficult. In the aftermath of her suicide, they began to realize that there were signs and symptoms of depression and suicide all around them, but they didn't know what to look for. And the more that they began to research and study, the more they began to realize that these signs and symptoms were all around them to be seen had they had known what to look for. And it's really out of that the With Hope Foundation was created, so that no other parent, no other family, no other school, no other church would ever have to deal with what they've had to deal with. And to make that situation even more tragic, one by one, many of Amber's friends came forward and they said they knew that she was thinking about it, that she knew that she was talking about doing it, but you know what? They didn't know what to do. And they said, well, we promised her we were going to keep the secret. And see, here's the reality. Here's one of the things that motivates me, and I hope you begin to understand this as we start off here this evening, that in 90% of suicides, the person that attempted or committed suicide told somebody else before they did it. 90% of the time, the person who's attempted or committed suicide told somebody else before they did it. By the way, that's also true in the majority of school shootings as well. And so if you don't hear anything else, if you don't catch the message, if you don't hear the stats or anything else, if you remember this one thing, if a friend ever comes to you and says, hey, I want to tell you something, but you got to promise me you're not going to tell anybody, and your friend tells you that they're thinking about taking their own life, it's not a secret you want to keep. I mean, by this time, I could literally fill a room like this up. I could fill this whole campus up with other adults and teenagers who would want to look you in the eyes with tears streaming down their face and say, look, you don't want to walk around with what I walk around with for the rest of my life. And it was really out of that I want to make sure that you understand that this is not a secret that you want to keep. And I hope if you understand that one thing, then you and I are already in partnership and beginning to save lives, to helping people understand and combat that lie that they think anybody would understand, and then no one would be able to help them. Because part of the reality is what we're saying is, if there was a face, then, if depressed people looked a certain way, it would be easy to spot. But ladies and gentlemen, that is the face of depression and suicide. And that's the point. She looks like everybody else. Because here's the reality. Most of us, and let's just face it, a lot of us Christians, we know how to play the game, right? We know what to say to get people off our backs. We know how to pretend to act to make people think we're okay, that we have it all together. And many of us, if not most of us, have that ability, have been working on that ability for a long time to present this image. By the way, I don't think that glorifies God, but that's a sermon for another day. But what we want to do is most of us have a couple of people in our lives that we have those conversations with that know us beyond the exterior, beyond the false demeanor. And usually it's those people that we have those conversations with. Because I want you to think about this. If you know the name Charles Spurgeon was a prolific author and considered one of kind of the church forefathers of Christianity, and probably wrote more about his struggle with depression and his battle than maybe anybody else, except for maybe Job. If you begin to read through the book of Job, and all of a sudden he says things like, I can't even eat for sighing. I hate my life. Day after a hopeless day. My heart is broken. My groans pour out like water. Depression haunts my days. My weary nights are filled with pain, and I cry to you, God, but you don't answer me. And I said, but God loves you and has a wonderful plan for your life. By the way, don't be a Bible Band-Aid person, please. When you know somebody, here's the thing. Scripture is powerful, and it's sharp as a two-edged sword, and it penetrates. I believe wholeheartedly, I've given my life for Scripture and for the Lord. But please understand the tact that's needed in communicating Scripture, and not in a pithy way, and not handling Scripture in a way that it's meant to be. Sorry, I got a hold of the soapbox for that. Again, I'll save you that one for another day. Lamentations says this, my soul is downcast within me, and yet this I call to mind. Therefore I have hope. Because of the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. In the morning, they are new every morning. the one piece of scripture I want to make sure that we talk about tonight, and I get a chance to share all over the place, and most of the time I'm in a non-Christian setting, so I don't get to share the word. I don't get to talk about Jesus and God, so I'm always excited when I get to, because this is way more better. It's right. Yeah, that's right. I said more better. John 10:10 says this. He said, the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. This is Jesus talking. Jesus says, but I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a culture and a time where Satan is doing a fantastic job of killing and destroying lives in humongous numbers, as we're about to see. And I want you to understand facts like this, that right now depression is the leading cause of disability in the world. Depression is also the leading cause of disability in the United States. In other words, there are more people suffering from depression now than any other time in history. And what I like to do is stand back and talk to some of our liberal friends and go, you've got the reins of our country. How's that going? How's that working for everybody? And right now, the business world is spending over $1 billion a year, $1 billion a year just on mental health issues in the workplace, because depression is at an all-time high and it's climbing on a daily basis. Here's the challenging part. Only about 33%, 1 out of 3 teenagers suffering from depression will seek help in the United States. 1 out of 3. In other words, 2/3 or 66% or more of teenagers suffering, not just suffering from clinical depression, won't seek help. Now, obviously, one of the knee-jerk reactions, hopefully, that you have when you hear a statistic like this is, all right, why not? Why would somebody not get help if they were suffering from clinical depression? And I really think it's twofold. One is you and I live in a world where mental health has this stigma to it that where if I had a physical problem, then I would go and have it, plastic surgery or whatever, fixed or taken, put on, whatever we need to do. And that would be normal behavior. But if I have something going on internally, then suddenly I need to be tough and suck it up. And can I say sometimes in the Christian community, that's even more dangerous? Because in the same way that if you walked up to somebody and you saw someone taking insulin, chances are you wouldn't go down there and goes, where's your faith? You need to get in the Word more, man. You need to get on your knees before the Lord. Now, here's what it's saying. I think God does heal people. And I know people who have been healed. I know people who have been healed of diabetes. God still heals. I still believe He's in the business of doing that. And He can do those things. But just in the same way, where diabetes is a chemical issue in the body, that depression is not a feeling. Depression is not an emotion. It can be. But when you talk about clinical depression, it's a disease. And when I talk about depression this evening, I'm talking about the disease part of that. I'm talking about a lower serotonin and norepinephrine levels that happens in your brain for a number of reasons that we're going to discuss. And in the same way, you wouldn't want to try to just pray somebody out of, hopefully you're praying for the healing of somebody with diabetes, but you would look at somebody with depression in the same way and understanding it's just as much a chemical issue as anything else. All right, so let me say this. Let me pick on you for a second. What's your name? Evan. All right, so let's say Evan's cruising to church and it's Sunday morning and he is stoked because he loves youth group, right? It's like his whole life. He lives it. He believes it. He just loves it. And so he's cruising and he's just like singing. He's so excited and he's like walking across the street and he doesn't see the big bus. Bam! Duh. And like he's in this big clump in the middle of the street. And everybody's like, dude, that's not good, right? And so what's your name? Lauren's like, hey, your bone's sticking out of your leg, bro. You should probably get that looked at. And Evan's like, yeah, I think it's broke. My leg really hurts. Yeah, and they were like, duh. And all of a sudden, and you start hearing the sirens and stuff come, the ambulance is coming, and all of a sudden, everyone's amazed, but he stands up, grabs his leg, and starts walking. And everybody's like going, what's going on, dude? What's going on? Where are you going? He turns around, he's like, youth group. And so he cruises, and he sits in the front row, because where else would you sit, right? And so he's hanging out there, and he's like, yes, this is going to be awesome. I'm so excited. And that's why he's sitting there. What's your name? Justin's like, dude, you're bleeding all over the carpet. I think pastor's going to be a little bit ticked. You probably need to deal with that. People are like, yeah, your bone's sticking out of your leg, bro. Let's call an ambulance. Let's get you some help. This is not okay. We need to get this dealt with. And then he's like, no, Nah, dude, it's cool. I got it. What would you think of our friend? Yeah, you'd be like, like homeboy's got issues, right? Okay, here's the thing. There's a point to this. There's a point. Trust me, a point. Can I tell you this? I talk to people all the time and say, Vince, I'm so sick and tired of feeling this way. I'm so sick and tired of feeling the same way over and over, and I just don't feel like anybody would understand and that nothing would really help me. And I said, dude, let's get you some help, man. There are more resources and help that's available now than any other time in history. And they're like, oh, no, dude, it's cool, I got it. What? But see, if it was a broken leg, we live in a culture be like, well, of course you would get that fixed. But if it's something internally, then all of a sudden we're like, oh. And please understand what I'm saying. Do I believe God heals people? Absolutely. Does obedience to Scripture and the Word change people's hearts and change people's lives? Absolutely, without a doubt. And I think Satan uses, and there's this muddy thing, but, and the question for many folks is, how much of this is spiritual warfare? How much of this is chemical? How much is that, and the reality is, I don't know. But here's what I do know. That if you're a believer, that you're going before your Creator, and you're trusting the one who made you, who knit you together in your mother's womb, and you're trusting that He loves you, and He wants the best for you, and He's got a plan for you, and so you're spending time in prayer, you're spending time in the Word, you're bringing people around, you're asking people to pray for you, and as you're doing that, you're seeking help as well for whatever else, because if it's a chemical issue, God may heal you, and that would be awesome. And if He doesn't, go get help more, right? And don't just wallow in that circle, but understand that peace. And here's part of the next thing why this is so dangerous, is because untreated depression is the number one cause for suicide in the U.S. Untreated depression is the number one cause for suicide in the U.S. You really can't talk about suicide and talk about depression without talking about depression. And that's why these two pieces really have to go hand in hand. Researchers estimate that 1,000 teenagers in the U.S. attempt suicide every day. You multiply that by a month, you're looking at over 30,000 suicide attempts every month just by teenagers. But look at this number. Over 38,000 people, including adults and everyone, kill themselves in the U.S. every year. That's like going to the Honda Center, going to a stadium where it seats about 17,000, 18,000 for a hockey game, football game, and to be able to put those kind of numbers in perspective, that is half the number of people that kill themselves every year. And yet you and I claim we have a God who is a God of hope, and a God of life, and a God of love, and a God of healing. About 1 out of 25 teens, about 3 to 5% of teens will actually experience clinical depression every single year. But look at some of these stats. Right now, suicide is the third leading cause of death for ages 15 to 24. Just in the last few months, one of the things that's changed in this statistic, for the first time in history, there are more teens that die from suicide than from car crashes. And that's just changed in the last few months. Second leading cause of death for college-age students, and the fastest growing age group for suicide right now is middle school. We hear stories all the time. Just a couple months ago, a student, seventh grade, 12-year-old boy, went on campus in Oklahoma, went in a bathroom, shot and killed himself before school started. Well, I hear that story consistently when you hear stories like that. A person dies from suicide every 14.2 minutes, and about 1 out of 5 high school students will think about suicide. Now, I shared with you a little bit in my abode of, I've been a pastor for about 25 years, and obviously, we do weddings and funerals, and I prefer doing weddings over funerals, just for the record, but when I've had to do a funeral from parents who've lost their teen, there's not a lot to say. When you have to do that for anybody who's out of suicide, not a lot of comforting words can happen at the time. A lot of you can share some things, but it's a tough spot. And the reason I share the stat with you and why this is important is because if you're one of the 5, for instance, if you're one of the 5 high schoolers, if 20% of high schoolers at some point in their life, in some time of high school, will think about committing suicide, it's a pretty lonely place to be. And I tell you why. Because when I was in high school, I was absolutely one of the 5. I grew up, my mom and dad have been drug addicts, alcoholics my whole life. Right before I got into college, my father died up in Folsom County Prison. And my mom's 62 right now. She lives on the streets in L.A. somewhere. I have no idea where she is. She won't let any of us help her. My grandfather died of cirrhosis of the liver, which is when your liver gets, messed up because of alcohol. And I tell you that is because for me, when I was young, when I was growing up, home was a place I wanted to stay away from, not one place I wanted to go to. And the only thing that I saw was a friend of mine who was a great football player and ended up getting a scholarship. And then when he graduated from college, he got a job, and all of a sudden his life looked totally different than everybody else. And in the midst of this, I grew up and I became a Christian. A buddy of mine tricked me into going to a Christian camp my freshman year. Didn't tell me it was a Christian thing. I was kind of ticked about that. And then, but at this camp, I ended up having this incredible experience. And a lot of people were like, weren't you afraid to go to hell? Honestly, I really wasn't. And maybe it was because I didn't truly understand what hell was. But when they started talking about a God who wanted to be my dad, when they start referring to God as Abba, all of a sudden it's a different playing field. When they start talking about a dad who will never leave me and never forsake me to a kid as many issues as I had, I was all in. And I buried my life in this thing. But soon after that, honestly, I had a really bad experience at the church, and the youth pastor thought that I really wasn't trying as hard as I could have, and so he asked me to go find another youth group because that church probably wasn't a good fit for me. And I was like, I'm not sure I'm buying this whole Jesus thing, because all the Christians I met are the biggest bunch of fakes of anybody else. And the people that I was selling drugs with and doing drugs with were so much more friendly and so much more easy to connect with and get along with than any of the church kids. And I was over it. And right about that time, I ended up doing pretty well in school. I went from football season and went right into wrestling. From wrestling, I went right into track. And by the time I got to my senior year, I earned a couple of scholarships, had a couple of opportunities. I could have gone to school to play, had my choice of schools, had my choice of sports. And I thought, all right, this is going to be it. I'm going to make this turn out of here. But in the midst of all this stupidity and all the stuff I was doing, I ended up failing government my senior year, my first semester. I don't recommend that, just for the record. And in an instant, all my scholarship opportunities, everything that I had worked for was gone. And I was so over it. I was so tired of showing up to football season and watching all my friends have brand new football cleats and brand new gear, and I was still wearing the ones from last year that were a little bit too tight because my feet had grown. Or all my friends that got new wrestling cleats every single year. And I watched my friends go motorcycle riding and go to camps and do all this other stuff that I would love to have done, but I just end up staying at home summer with my grandma. And so by the time I got to that place, even though I had known the Lord, I said, you know what though? But no one would really understand what I've been through. No one would really get it, how I'm feeling. I don't see how anybody could ever help me. You know what? I just don't think I have the strength to keep doing this. So I started thinking about suicide. Started making my plans, started putting it together. And can I tell you this? And the reason I want to show you this stat is because if you're one of the 5, it's about the most lonely place you could be. You can be in a crowd of people every day of your life and feel completely empty and lonely. And I hope you understand this. While that stat is sad, and I hope that we get to see this change in our lifetime, but if you ever get there, just know you're not alone, you're not weird, and you're not psycho. But there's a lot of kids, sadly, feeling a lot like you in that kind of circumstance. That jumps to about 1 out of 12 college students has a suicide plan. Now, let's say this. If thinking about suicide is kind of stepping onto path to kind of towards suicide, if someone has a plan, just understand that means they're pretty far down that road towards suicide. And so here's your first coaching tip. If you ever engage with somebody, if you ever find out one of your friends is thinking about suicide, one of the first questions you want to ask them is this: do you have a plan? And if they can tell you, yes, when I commit suicide, if I commit suicide, I'm going to do this, this, and this, and they give you the details of whatever that is, that hopefully the alarms are going off at the back of your head, and you realize this is not something I want to just hope that it goes away. This is something where you want to get them connected with somebody immediately that can help them. because you don't want to play that game. More teenagers and young adults die of suicide than from cancer, heart disease, AIDS, birth defects, stroke, pneumonia, influenza, and chronic lung disease combined every year. But it's not a fun topic that a lot of people want to talk about, sadly. So, but we've got celebrities right now, and again, this is a little bit more for the public school setting, but showing people that, public figures that are talking about their bouts with not only with depression, but also their attempted suicide attempts. And you have people who, like a Halle Berry, who says, everything on the outside looks so good in my life, and no one really knew what struggle I was having on the inside. Or Ken Griffey Jr. that talks about the pressure of living and growing up underneath having a celebrity dad. But then there's a whole lot of celebrities that didn't make it, who didn't get help. One of the ones that hit me hard, and maybe some of you, is when Junior Seau committed suicide just a little while ago. Here's this guy, all-pro linebacker for the San Diego Chargers, and a person who should have been tough enough to be able to deal with it is probably him. Somebody that was probably stronger than all of us in here, that should have been strong enough to deal with, was probably him. Yet it didn't have anything to do with toughness. It didn't have anything to do with strength. Because in his autopsy, and guess what? 2 chemicals were dangerously low in Junior Seau: serotonin and norepinephrine. 80% of those who have attempted suicide will attempt it again. Some of the risk factors here: if someone's been physically, emotionally, sexually abused, they're more likely. If you've had a family member commit suicide, again, that might be something that's passed down genetically in your family. Alcohol and drug problems oftentimes point to that. For instance, every time my mom would get out of rehab, the joke was how many minutes it would take her to go right back into doing what she was doing before she got in there. And because I really think, the problem was, there was a lot of problems there with my mom, and more than I can get into right now. But I think one of the things was that the drugs and alcohol were a symptom of the problem and weren't the problem. So she would go in and get off of and detox from whatever she was on, but she would never deal with the problem. So as soon as she got out, she went right back into grabbing the coping mechanisms that she's always known. People with learning disabilities, unplanned pregnancies. We're even seeing highly gifted students because the incredible pressure. Like this, here's one for students. Do you realize, guys, especially for high school students, if you ask people my age, if you told them that you have friends who have a 4.6, a 4.8 grade point average, most of us my age would have no idea of what you're talking about. Because the whole AP thing and the whole 5-point scale and all that stuff, that's something new. But can I tell you, there's an enormous amount of pressure that comes to us. My oldest daughter she just took AP Euro. She's just finishing that week, took the big test. She's also an athlete. I mean, she's doing all kinds of homework and all kinds of this and that and the other, and we keep asking her and ourselves the question, is this really worth it, sweetie? Is this worth it to push it this hard? Is this the quality of life that you're hoping to have? And I mean, we don't have the answer for that. We're still figuring that out. But I really do think the pressure that's put on you is probably more than any generation previously. So let me end and turn to the corner here. How do you get depression, all right? So we've talked about what depression is. Take a look at these brains. I always feel like saying, this is your brain on drugs. No, this is not it. The brain on the right, this is a picture of somebody's brain that's kind of firing on all cylinders. This is when the chemicals are being produced in your body, right? So like, for instance, if I have Monty go and I say, Monty, I got a street bike, and I want you to go out on the street here. I want you to go on the freeway without a helmet because that's cooler, right? And you're going to go, and I want you to get going about 80. I want you to bring the front wheel up. I want you to take your feet off the pegs, and I want you to wave to everybody as you're doing it, okay? What chemical will probably be released in his body during that activity? Adrenaline, like a lot of it, right? His adrenaline gland would probably just burst open if you tried that for real. But our bodies are chemical makeups. I mean, much of what we do. If we have, most of us, I think all of us, have a pancreas and a liver, right? And that balances out some chemistry in our body. That balances out some of the sugars, some of the insulin in our bodies. And if your body can't keep that balance, and your body, your chemistry gets out of balance, and you have too much insulin in your body, you have a disease. What's that disease called? Diabetes, yeah. If you have too much sugar, you have type 2 diabetes. You have too little sugar, you have type 1 diabetes. But our bodies are chemicals, are chemical reactions that are going on all the time. 2 of the chemicals that your brain produces are serotonin and norepinephrine. And when there is some kind of tragedy, sometimes trauma, to whether it be emotionally because of a trauma or an event in your life, or because it's a physical, like a concussion, and any kind of a brain injury that messes up the production. Then you can see the brain on the left, something happened to that person that injured their brain where it's not producing the chemicals. And guess which two chemicals usually drop in production immediately during that kind of either a trauma or an injury? Serotonin, norepinephrine. And so this is a visual. When we talk about depression is a chemical issue, that's right. Your brain's firing all cylinders. Something happened, your brain's not firing all cylinders. Does that make sense? Because I think it's important to understand. So like, for instance, we talked about the insulin depression. Only about 4% of people that have diabetes does it go left untreated, and yet we're looking at 66% of teenagers who are suffering from clinical depression. Does that go untreated? So what causes a person's level to drop? The first one's the big one. It's called post-traumatic stress disorder. But think about just the words there. So after a trauma, something happens in your brain where your plumbing gets stuck, so to speak. So if, like, for instance, somebody who's dealt with a sexual abuse issue, one of the reasons why that pain, that feeling, that memory is so right there all the time still, regardless of how many times you try to suppress it, ignore it, or not tell anybody about it, but it's always there, because it's like it gets stuck in your plumbing and it's still in the front of that because it's never been dealt with in a healthy way. You've never processed that in a healthy way. So after the trauma, the stress from that causes disorder in your brain, which lowers your serotonin, norepinephrine levels. Does that make sense, to go back to the picture of the brain of why PTSD is why that works? And so at one time, Time Magazine did an article and said that we were losing a soldier a day to suicide. That more soldiers have died from suicide than all of them combined. I believe right now, the last time I heard, in the Middle East combined in all the wars that we've had and the most recent wars. But you can imagine, a soldier comes back, he comes home, he sees who knows what horrible thing, comes back in, he's with his family, he's with his kids, and talking about, Satan comes in and says, nobody's going to really understand what you're thinking. You know what, you're right. Why would my family ever understand what I've experienced? And what could they possibly do to help me? There's those two lies that the accuser comes in over. Make no doubt about it. That is a lie from the pit of hell, and that people do get help and are helped all the time, every day. And the first thing you may try may not be the magic thing, but getting help is the key. These are all professional athletes who have committed suicide, and they're all part of that. And Dave Duerson is from the Chicago Bears, Junior Seau, we mentioned earlier. In both of their suicide notes, they said, please study my brain because I don't want anybody to have to struggle with what I've struggled with. And as I mentioned in his autopsy with Junior Seau, we knew exactly what happened there. The bullying piece continues to be huge. But let me give you a visual, the connecting piece between bullying and suicide. If you find somebody who's already at the edge of the cliff and is looking for an opportunity to jump off, it's not going to take much to push them over. And what happens oftentimes is you'll have a person who is insecure or whatever else and looking to control something. They want to find someone that they can control in order to feel better about themselves. They may not consciously know that, but this is what they subconsciously often do. And so whether it be control them physically by beating this up or controlling them verbally by kind of out-talking them, ripping on them, whatever the case may be. And so if a person's looking for someone like that, and all of a sudden you find someone who's struggling from depression, who's beginning to withdraw, who's wanting to disconnect, who doesn't even know if they want to be here anymore, who obviously self-esteem, all the other pieces that, what's going on there, you could see why it'd be so easy for a bully to find them and why it wouldn't take much to push them over. So it's kind of like that picture of them at the breaking point. Think about this. Let me skip this video. Look at this stat. And this is your conversation for next week as well. That if a student identifies himself as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender, they're 4 times more likely to commit suicide or attempt suicide. And if someone is questioning their sexuality, they end up statistically being 3 times more likely to attempt suicide. Now, please understand, this is not a Christian statistic. This is just out there in the public forum. And I don't know about you, I look at this stuff and I feel like going, hello. That's a technical term for, do you not see? You know? But understanding this, and here's what I hope, especially for Christians, that if you know someone, especially, imagine trying to process these feelings and everything else in the church. I mean, that's a harder place to do it probably than anywhere else, because they probably feel less safe there than everywhere else. And we can go all kinds of details, but if you find someone, if you have a relationship with someone, if you know someone is struggling in one of these areas, identifying this, please understand this. If you have a friend that you know is 3 and 4 times more likely to commit suicide, I hope you're the kind of person that seeks them out and that goes after to be their friend. When everybody else says because kind of what we were talking about before, when you disagree with somebody, you can't just disagree, you must hate me. You're like, no, I just disagree, hate swap, But when you come alongside and you start loving on friends and help walk them through, you begin to change. You begin to change culture. You begin to change the viewpoint. You begin to change lots of imagery. And I'm not saying that I think Scripture's very clear. This is not God's best for us. And I think because of that, you could read into that and go, hello, maybe God does know what he's talking about after all, right? But understanding that piece, I think that's a huge one as well. Let me end with this. I asked a friend, I said, hey, what does depression feel like? Help us understand. And I described in my past what does depression felt like, how did I deal with that, and I kind of showed it in these pictures, and I said, a lot of people kind of are walking around under this dark cloud, kind of that Eeyore, it's my birthday, kind of that feeling, right? Or kind of feeling like you want to hide out in a dark room. And I said, what do you think? And he looks at those, he's like, no. Okay, so how would you describe it? And this is what he said, I think it's fascinating. He said, look, when you struggle with depression, you don't feel like you're under a dark cloud. You said you feel like you are the dark cloud. You don't feel like you're in a dark room. He said you feel like you are the dark in the room, because depression doesn't feel like something you have, it's something you are. And I thought, man, that's so insightful when we have trouble trying to help people see a world, a reality outside of what they're experiencing right now. It is so difficult because they can't even imagine. For many of you, if I want to say, hey, imagine back to a time when you were super excited or happy about something. Or imagine back to a time when you were really sad about something. Or imagine back to a time when you felt different than you were right now. Chances are, if you're in a healthy place, you could probably remember and maybe even have some twinges of that emotion as you're remembering back to that memory or whatever that case may be. But for someone struggling from depression, they really almost don't even have the ability to imagine feeling any different than they do right now. And that's why when, you could say all these great things, but they can't even get it. And what a great breeding ground for Satan to come in with his lie and say, well, nobody would understand you anyways, right? No one could, and we see that happen all the time. Think about this, which I think is interesting that these comedians are talking about their depression. But Owen Wilson describes his depression as more the traditional kind. He's withdrawing, he's disconnected, he's not involved, his quality of his work's going down, all this kind of stuff. Whereas Jim Carrey talks about his depression as almost the opposite of, instead of sleeping all the time, he's having trouble sleeping at all. He's always on edge. Everything makes him mad. He's always irritated, lashing out at people. But yet both of those are just as much depression as the other. Because depression looks different for different people. Let me ask you this question as we end. If you ever get to a place where the intensity of your emotions doesn't match your circumstances, that should be a red flag. If your mom comes in and tells you to clean your room and you fly off the handle and you want to punch a hole through a wall, that might be a little bit much, right? But when you see things like that, because lots of times, if we see a guy who's just always on edge and just snappy and mad all the time, most of the time we don't think he might be struggling from depression. We think that dude's got anger issues, he needs to get a grip. But please understand, that could be just as much depression as the person who's over in the corner crying and doesn't want to get out of bed. That both of those, because depression looks different for different people. And so the best way of this, if you ever get to a place where an emotion locks onto you and you can't get rid of it, whether it be sadness, whether it be anger, whether it be numbness, I mean, a lot of people I know that have struggled with self-injury and cutting and doing stuff like that is they feel like that numbness feeling has locked onto them, and they get so sick and tired of feeling numb that they'll actually begin, and when they physically hurt themselves, the only time that they kind of snap out of that. I mean, there's all kinds of other pieces, but when that thing latches onto you and you can't get rid of it, that might be the chance that there's something going on there. Okay? Now as we end, let me be clear. I still believe that the first attempt, your first approach, your non-stop thing that you are attempting in any of these things is going to the Lord in prayer. I believe prayer changes stuff. I think God is in the business of healing still. I don't think I think that's our first and greatest defense of anything else we can do. Understanding what God says in His Word, we don't want to ever set that aside. That's got to be center to everything that guides us and what we're doing and how we're doing it. But can I just say this? Sometimes depression isn't a spiritual issue. Sometimes depression isn't a spiritual issue. Sometimes it's a medical one. And does God intervene in medical issues all the time? Absolutely. But I think sometimes we can get so hyper-spiritual about everything that everything becomes a spiritual issue. And in the same way, we're hoping you would pray for somebody who has diabetes, who's taking insulin. You wouldn't tell them to stop taking insulin and have more faith. And the same way, if someone's struggling with depression, just go, dude, just suck it up, dude. You just get more serotonin and norepinephrine. Just do that. You'll feel better. That's not helpful. You can imagine, right? And so as we close, I want to bring it back around, because the thing that we start with is the thing that we end with. Everything that you have in front of you has hotline numbers, has websites, has all kinds of pieces to get conversations going, to initiate those conversations. Everything that I've talked about is inside that trifold that you have for all the statistics and those things for you to hold on to. Also inside there, you have a wallet card. And I think, honestly, this is probably one of the best things that we hand out. And I want to encourage you to take this out and take this home with you. You're probably not going to remember the stats. You're not going to remember all the signs and symptoms and everything else. But hopefully what you'll be able to, if you hold on to something like this, on the inside of the card are some of the signs and symptoms of depression. On the back of that, some of the signs and symptoms of suicide. And you know what? And because next week, next month, next year, if and when you get put into a situation, you may not remember all these pieces, but this could be an incredible life-saving tool. And we've seen it work over and over and over again. Average freshman class in a high school, about 25% will know someone who's either attempted or committed suicide. By the time that same freshman class becomes seniors, over 90% of that class will know someone who's attempted or committed suicide. This is the culture we live in. But we serve a God who is bigger than the lies of Satan. Would you agree? Let's pray.